This oral history of museum computing is provided by Shelley Mannion and was recorded on the 28th of May 2021 by Paul Marty and Kathy Jones.
So yeah, I feel like the invisibility. What struck me about your original, sort of approach and about where you were describing this theme of invisibility is that I feel like, well, you just mentioned, Paul, that you have there's the invisibility of the work of kind of what happens in museum technology departments, but in maybe the invisibility to the people from outside, people from outside, meaning visitors, right, or the public, or kind of people who consume the things that we produce. But I actually think there's another really interesting layer of complexity to this, which is the invisibility within the museum of our work, right? So I presume this has probably come out in other conversations. But I feel like that invisibility works in two ways. Like it works in our favor, and it also works against us. So it works in our favor in the respect that it allows us to experiment and do things that the institution maybe wouldn't formally sanction or approve of. And so I guess maybe an example that I'd use is my work at the SDDC, which is the Samsung Digital Discovery Center at the British Museum. So it was one of the first and sort of most ambitious digital learning programs that kicked off around 2009, I think. So I was one of the kind of first, it was the first co-manager of the space. And it was a program, sponsored by Samsung, targeted children and children and their families. So, it was basically young people. So we were in the schools and young audiences team, which is where that activity sat. It was, designed to kind of create digital learning programs for families and for schools. So, formal and informal learning. And I guess one of the where I feel like I benefited from invisibility is that nobody was really that interested in what was happening in education. I think this is sadly true, in the museum sector in general. What happens in museum education departments is seen as sort of what's the right word? Not quite academically rigorous enough to be interesting to the kind of the curatorial departments and other areas of the museum. And so it's seen as nice, part of the museum's mission. I think there's a sort of often a patronizing attitude on the part of the kind of some of the curatorial staff towards what happens in education. Which is incredibly unfortunate considering how qualified museum educators often are, and how credentialed they are. But as I say, that that kind of attitude, which what definitely as I say, I benefited from that. I feel like while I was at the British Museum. So the fact that there wasn't a lot of scrutiny, about what I did, I had a lot of autonomy. And not only was that satisfying from the point of view of, kind of professionally, building my skills and, kind of what I felt like taking ownership of something and building something and having the freedom really to make my mark on it. But equally, it meant that, as I said, there were a lot of things that I got to do, that I genuinely don't think would with kind of more interest and oversight and more kind of scrutiny. I don't think that I would have been able to do that. So yeah, I mean, certainly the you mentioned earlier the augmented reality work that we did in the SDDC, which was it was really interesting to me that I now I seem to keep finding myself at the beginnings of these sort of these technological sort of momentous these moments of sea change, I guess. So in other words, right around the time I graduated university was the internet suddenly, like in the early 90s, I made a website and was like, oh, there's this thing called the World Wide Web, and like, oh wow, and that sort of dominated the first part of my career. And then at the point at which I sort of, pivoted, back towards my original interest in in technology, and ended up, as I say, at the British Museum, at the SDDC. Augmented reality was one of those things that was just taking off. And now, interestingly, I find myself at a blockchain art company. Again, at the beginnings, of this sort of interesting development. But yeah, I guess, as I say, I think the way that we were able to work with augmented reality, which was, benefited from the fact that nobody was, was evaluating my sort of proposals, was looking over my shoulder, kind of asking me questions, or necessarily to justify why I was making those choices. And, of course, as I say, the downside of that, right, is that you have incredibly few resources. And one of the things I always felt surprised about was how the assumptions that people made about working for the British Museum, that, oh, well, you guys have all these resources, so of course you can do all that stuff. But no, I mean, I did it myself, like as a single individual, which again, I'm sure is a recurring theme in these conversations, that, being a museum technology person means that it's kind of all on you. And, you develop skills that you didn't have before. I mean, I can remember this slightly harrowing moment when I realized that I'd actually designed and not quite designed yet, but I'd advertised and got bookings for like a family workshop around augmented reality, and I literally didn't know what I was going to do. And so, and it was, I had maybe 2 weeks, and I remember sitting, kind of slightly panicked, in my bedroom in my tiny apartment in London, being like, okay, I really got to get it together now. Like, I have to research AR and figure out how in 2 weeks time I'm going to sort of design some sort of digital learning, experience for these, for these families that are going to come in and have the expectation of, doing AR at the British Museum. But what was interesting was that we started so early, so that I was able to see at least 3 generations of that technology in a very short space of time. So, so the very first project that I ended up then, running, kind of, probably mostly figuring out that afternoon, Saturday afternoon in my bedroom, was, it was based around the first, I guess, iteration of AR, which involved these kind of AR markers that look very similar to QR codes. So they were the only thing that the AR browsers at the time that were available that you could download onto mobile device, because obviously the point was actually to get, as with, digital learning generally, right, is to get, get learners out into the museum itself, right, and get them interacting directly with the objects and the technology mediating ideally their experience of, of looking or of understanding the collection. So anyway, so we started with something which was like a downloadable, app called Junio, which was one of the few at the time. There was like Wikitude, and there were a couple of others. But anyway, Junio was the one we ended up using, and I put these markers. It was a temporary exhibition. If you ping me afterwards, I'll tell you what it was called. It was about ancient Egypt, and we put these markers. I had to put the markers up temporarily in the museum, and then take in the gallery, and then take them down after the event. Because again, that's one of the other challenges, right, of working with technology in museums, is that there's always this tension, between things that are needed to help you kind of, mediate a digital experience or facilitate the digital experience, and the design, right, that is, and other challenges of the building, but that is kind of, certainly from the, from the kind of the curatorial side and the sort of exhibition design side, these types of, again, education interventions, are somehow perceived as unwelcome. So, but yeah, I put these markers around. Oh yeah, and then we worked with this great 3D animator called Ollie Venning. So he, yeah, really very talented. And so he created these 3D models that were based on objects in the museum. And we kind of did a hunt around the, a trail around the gallery where children had to find, they each got a phone and they had to find the markers in the gallery. And then scan them, and they would, on the marker itself, they would actually see this, this 3D model, animated 3D model, and that then was a clue to them being able to answer a question and sort of complete the activity. So that was the sort of first incarnation of AR. And then the second one, the second iteration was, I'm trying to think. This is, I knew this would be tough. I was like, I should have prepared for the call. What was the second iteration? Was, I think, scanning images. Yeah. So the second iteration was scanning images. Oh, or was it location based even? We ran a project, I think, with teenagers on larger tablets, and we had them go around the gallery, and we could actually place, if we had them stand in a particular location, we could actually have them, yeah, I think it was location based, and we had them scan a marker, but then they could move around and actually see, something like superimposed in the space. But then, we moved on to something which was even more sophisticated, which is obviously, what we were really aiming for, which was the promise of AR when we sort of first started working with it. And that was the, that was actually being able to scan the objects themselves, right? Because you need something to sort of trigger the AR experience, whether that's, a location or a marker or an image, right? All of those things we used. We went from a marker, I think, to an image, to a location. But then, really the holy grail of AR is actually being able to, for it to, the device and the technology to be able to recognize an actual object in the gallery, right? And that's also the beauty of it, that you can potentially, expose or impose something on the view, right, of that object, which enhances it in some way, right? I mean, because, so much of our work, right, and this is about, museum interpretation education generally, but perhaps even more about to do with technology, but it's about restoring context, right? Like that is arguably one of the most fundamental things that we're attempting to do, right, is to restore context, particularly in a museum which is historical museum, which is the British Museum is the history of the world, right? So anyway, we're trying to restore context. And so in that case, the idea that where we eventually got to, and obviously exceeded my own abilities as a sort of technologist, I guess. So we worked with an agency to do this. One of the few who had an algorithm that was good enough to be able to recognize stuff in the galleries directly with changing light conditions. So, and this is interestingly, it's still quite something that's still quite challenging these days. But I was really pleased with where we got to with it. So again, it was for the Ancient Egypt Gallery. It was a permanent gallery. Yeah, there was a little pot of money, sort of in addition to, as set aside for education. And so we developed something which, yeah, I'm not sure if it's still used, but the technology is still there. But to be able to then see things superimposed over the experience, to be able to scan the objects themselves, and the objects themselves to be the trigger, which was obviously brilliant. That was the goal when we kind of first started working on it. So anyway, like I say, the invisibility of our work, I think, was a real benefit, in being able to do things which, which again, the museum and certain, staff members would have been really challenged by, had we had to defend it to them, I think.
Can I jump in with a quick question?
Yeah,
What
go
was
for it.
the reaction of the curators to these AR projects in the galleries?
They were either not aware of them, or just like, okay, well, that's education. They're doing their thing. They're delighted to be able to, to put a few glowing quotes from attendees, into their sort of final report, which is like, hey, yes, we ran a strand of education programming alongside this exhibition and it was a success. And here's some nice quotes, here's some stats. We had X number of children through demographics. We did this many number of family programs. We had this number of school groups come through. So yeah, I think there were very, very few who ever really engaged with it directly. I had much more success with the scientists and the conservation department. Had some really rewarding and satisfying collaborations with them. And again, in designing some of the school programs for the SDDC, I think we had some really fascinating collaborations where they provided some of the material, they had real interest, and they also hired there was a sort of a liaison between, who sort of straddled, two worlds, who sat in the science and, conservation. So it was Conservation and Scientific Research Department, CSR, and education. So, kind of was involved in doing some education work. And then, he provided a real bridge, between us. Him being embedded, in CSR, I think gave the education work then some visibility, and equally, I think there was a greater interest amongst them in technology, right? There's less, there were fewer technophobes. They were much more open-minded about embracing the possibility of technology, and oftentimes I think because they were using technology in their own work. And obviously the nature of their work is that, that to be good at what they do, they need to sort of keep abreast of changes in technology. Whereas, curators are mostly keeping abreast of changes in scholarship, right? Which is a, different nature of activity, I guess. So let's see. So I haven't covered Lugano yet, but that was maybe a good one. So we covered the Digital Learning Center. We talked about the first AR app, which was the one at the one for the Egyptian exhibition. And like I say, I'll find a few more details and send those through. Yeah, AR really did have its moment there. Yeah, the BM's first digital strategy. Yeah, that was super interesting. We did kind of fail. Okay, well, let me say a little bit about the program in Lugano, because I do think it's really important. I think there's a really important bit of history there, since a lot of the other people who you've interviewed actually participated in that program, often as instructors. So Susan Chin, Peter Samus, Jim Spadaccini, Scott Sayer, and Chris Wetterland. Gosh, who else do we have? Sarah Kenderdine. I feel like I could go on. There were probably several others that I'm not mentioning, but all of them came, and I mean, for years. I mean, I think I was Peter's teaching assistant for like, I don't know, 6 or 7 years probably. So he came. Yeah, it was the best thing ever. I mean, spending time with Peter was just a joy, right? But yeah, being able to kind of work together and be mentored by him. Not just as a sort of museum professional, but just as as a genuinely decent human, was something really remarkable. But yeah, I mean, so I was in the inaugural class for what was called the TechCH program, so Technology Enhanced Communication for Cultural Heritage. So this was at a tiny, sort of wouldn't go so far as to say provincial, but a little bit provincial, Swiss Italian university, which it was very new, and I think, I'm trying to think, did they just celebrate their 25th anniversary or something like that? Anyway, very, very kind of new, and therefore quite forward-thinking university. And there was a lab. They were, again, very, very much focused on kind of practical training. So there were a lot of, they started a series of international master's programs. So they had tourism and fashion and merchandising, and a lot of things that were I think probably unique, within the kind of Swiss, higher education system, which is, more I guess more traditional. But certainly, that was sort of their unique selling point, or what differentiated them as a sort of modern university. And so they started advertising these programs, and I was looking around at the time. I had worked in I'd worked in a few startups. I'd been working for several years, kind of professionally as a sort of web developer and web designer, and um, kind of content person, and I really wanted to get back into kind of the cultural sector, because I was trained in art history, and have always really had a passion for that. So I really wanted to find my way back into that world. And the fact that that this program was starting up, and that blended technology and cultural heritage, it was like a dream. I was like, this is perfect for me. Absolutely perfect. And yeah, kind of, yeah, serendipitously, my partner at the time got a job in Switzerland. And as I say, then I started, kind of looking around for what the opportunities were. And this program was starting up. So can't remember exactly how many of us there were in the first round. I'm going to say maybe 8 or so. But we were spoiled, I think. We had so much time that obviously, because of the fact that that the instructors were working professionally. And so, I really should call out Paolo Paolini, from the University, Milan Polytechnic, right? I think that's what it is. Politecnico di Milano, right? Anyway, for really having the foresight to organize the program, and to invite these amazing people who he had been kind of connecting with at Museums of the Web conferences, and other conferences, ICHIM, and other conferences in the preceding probably decade. And yeah, I mean, he just was starting up this program. He had some budget to bring them over. And so, clearly it wasn't practical for them to teach an entire sort of, kind of trimester, or I don't remember how it was organized, but, or semester or quarter, whatever. They could only take a certain period of time away from their busy jobs to come and teach. So we got them for, sort of, between 1 to 3 weeks, depending on how much time they could take off. But it was really intensive during that time. It was just, we were kind of with the instructors, from morning to late afternoon every day. And I mean, in Peter's class, which was, I think, called Interactive Communication for Cultural Heritage or something like that, we would, or Interactive Communication for Museums, ICM, I think we called it. Yeah. We also did, we did field trips. So I think at least 2 years we went down to the Venice Biennale together. And then we did, this was, again, very much Paolo's sort of approach was project-based. He really believed in kind of, hands-on learning, and less theoretical and very much practical, kind of produce a project, to produce something, actually make something. So we just did project after project. We produced CD-ROMs, and we did, we built websites, and we did, so quite a bit of that stuff I'd already done as part of my professional career. So, it was, for me, it was much less about the practical skills, although for other students that was new for them. But for me, it was really the opportunity to spend time with some of these, I consider to be, kind of luminaries, of museum technology, sort of field, and really, just absorb what their kind of their approach to things, and how, sort of how some it was an education and an introduction to some of the practices which now I have greater context for and greater understanding of. But those were the beginnings of sort of design thinking, and sort of and just user experience, even as a discipline, was kind of just getting just getting going in the very early noughties. And it wasn't necessarily a widely kind of accepted job description. And I remember a funny conversation I had with Davide Bolchini, who was one of the sort of instructors in the program. and one of our first sort of events, like a meet and greet, with canapes to welcome the first group of students, overlooking, the campus was like very close to this beautiful like Lake Lugano, and anyway, it's this like gorgeous microclimate, right, in Ticino, where it's just, often beautiful weather. It's sunny and beautiful, bright, even when it snows, and it's just, it's just a kind of breathtaking setting. So anyway, here we were in this, this stunning, kind of new campus, in the middle of this beautiful, beautiful place, kicking off this arguably, really a groundbreaking, sort of program. And I remember, I had a conversation with him like, oh, well, I guess, I remember I was like, oh, well, I guess where you sit on UX or usability or something like that is, the real question is, are you a Jacob Nielsen follower or are you not? Like, are you a fan or are you not? Because Jacob Nielsen was this polarizing figure, wasn't he? In the early days with his alert box, thing, and I used to just, like, I was religious, a religious reader of his, of his, sort of newsletter, I followed some of the other, people who, who worked with him, Donald Norman and Bruce Tognazzini, I remember there was somebody else, Carolyn Snyder was another one who wrote this book on paper prototyping, and I was like, oh my God, paper prototyping, that's a thing? Like, oh my God, like how cool is that? So, there was just this really, it was a really fun, exciting time where, the idea that, there was a whole world of new kinds of new practices that were kind of going to define this era of of kind of consumer technology, really, just the way that our lives were changing, and that and that people were researching this, and that there was as much a kind of a scientific side to it as there was a maybe an aesthetic side, so anyway, yeah, that was, but I remember he looked at me blankly and I was like, you don't know who Jacob Nielsen is? Like, how can you not know? I was like, what? How can you not know what I mean by this? Which is, yeah, it was quite funny. And I was like, well, I don't know about this program then, if they don't know who Jacob Nielsen is, then I feel like, well, yeah. Clearly that was, my kind of unhelpful reaction. But I think, as I say, the program was just phenomenal. Like as I say, being able to spend time with with Peter, with Susan, with Jim, like, hearing about what they did every day, the projects that they, that they built. And like I say, also learning how they were applying, because they were learning a lot of this stuff too, like, that, kind of how to, I remember Peter was the one who introduced me to personas for the first time, right? And he was introduced to personas by Rachel Smith. So I don't know, Paul, do you remember Rachel? So she used to do these amazing, like, she does this sort of visual facilitation. She like draws, there was one at Museums in the Web like a few years ago where, like, she it's like, yeah, visual facilitation during meetings and like drawing. Yeah, anyway, so yeah, and I remember he brought in this article from probably, yeah. But anyway, so she'd written this article because she was working for the new Media Consortium, right? Yeah, so she'd worked for them, and kind of Peter, right, because they were involved in pachyderm, right, in the development of pachyderm. And Peter introduced us to that because that was really his, that was a big thing, right? Like he's quite kind of huge. I mean, that was the first time that anyone had ever tried to create something which was, as far as I know, which was really a content management system specifically for interpretive media. Like, it was amazing. Of course, I never understood why he called it pachyderm. And I literally have spent, probably, I don't know, way too much time being like, Peter, why did you call like pachyderm? I don't know, like, it's a software system. You want to call it something that implies that it's fast, not slow, and like quite lean and not, old, big and wrinkly. I mean, all due respect to elephants and all that, but pachyderm, really? Like, why? Anyway, yeah, right. I mean, just yeah, I think his instincts and branding were a little bit off there, but yeah, I guess that's okay. He's good at everything else, so yeah. But yeah, basically, yeah, just I mean, yeah, I remember he showed us, like, he kind of, yeah, the templates, like the very first templates for pachyderm. We worked with those, like we even used pachyderm a couple of years. Students used pachyderm and actually built their projects in pachyderm. And so yeah, the kind of different interpretive templates that he shared and all that were just so kind of, yeah, it was just fantastic. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so good. And then, like I say, I remember so yeah, I remember Chris Wetterland. So she and Scott obviously, like, team taught, and it was really so much fun because they're just great. Like, they're just, incredibly engaging, instructors. But and they sort of have this great double act, whereas Scott is sort of on the technology side and Chris is on very much on the education and interpretive side. But I remember really learning a lot about fundamental principles of education from Chris, and the fact that she was just she was sort of, yeah, really, really, as were all of the instructors, very inclusive and very much about wanting to involve us in participatory learning. Whereas, and it's hilarious because the Italian students, for the most part, were like, this is crazy. We have never, ever experienced this before. Like, this is so not what we can do. Like, when Peter would be like, hey guys, let's have a discussion about something. What do you think? And, they were like, oh my God, he's interested in what we think. Like, he actually wants to know, like, he wants to engage us in some sort of, dialogue or conversation. And I mean, having kind of, grown up in the States and stuff, I think I'd had probably maybe enough contact with, with that, I guess that, just more interactive style of teaching. But the Italian students who had been very much, had very traditional educational experiences up to that point, just found it a complete revelation. Like, they fell in love with Peter. I mean, it's easy to fall in love with Peter, but they just absolutely, kind of like he rocked their world completely. And you could see the transformative effect that he had by showing an interest in their opinions, and by facilitating, kind of conversation and debate and stuff. But anyway, okay, I'll stop going on. I mean, you know how great Peter is, but yeah, so yeah, so yeah, it's a lot of funny conversations as well with between Peter and the Italian students and the debates and stuff that took place. Like, yeah. Anyway, so let's see. So yeah, so and okay, so another, yeah, I remember some of Chris's lectures. I remember, like I say, on some of the, like, fundamental principles of education. The idea that active learning and involving the learner, sort of in the process, rather than just sort of dumping information. And as I say, for a lot of these students, it was they just this sort of, like, as if the whole kind of revolution in education that happened in, like, the 60s and 70s is as if it never happened. Like, for them, they, here they were in the early noughties, like, getting it. You know what I mean? And then I remember Susan, yeah, I mean, she gave this great lecture on Web 2.0, in 1 year. And, and I remember, she was just challenging us, like, okay, what, so guys, let's talk about what, what is the definition of Web 2.0? Like, what does it mean? And at the time she was working with the Steve project, and she was working with, kind of, social tagging and stuff like that. And then as a result of kind of my involvement with that and her introducing that to me, then I ended up getting a grant from the Rubin Museum to do some work, specifically around, like, social tagging. And I built a Steve instance to collect tags and then analyze them and stuff, but for my thesis. But yeah, there were, as I say, it was such an interesting time. in terms of what was happening in our industry, and you know, and we were hearing about it really from the people who were, you know, who were sort of the pioneers in a way. That's what it felt like for us. And yeah, it just such an incredible, you know, yeah, such an incredible thing to have been a part of. So
Jump in and say your Steve instance at the Rubin Museum. I mean, that was very early for the Steve project. What was it like jumping on board there?
yeah, I mean, it was okay. I mean, it was kind of, it wasn't like I had a few, you know, I sent a few emails back and forth just in terms of figuring out how to like get it working and stuff. I mean, you know, obviously I'd been a web developer before, and it was built in like it was just on a lamp stack, right? So, you know, I was like, okay, fine, you know, no problem. Like my MySQL, you know, PHP, I'm like, okay, cool, I more or less get it. So yeah, it was okay. You know, I set it up, I customized it and stuff. I had a few emails back and forth with like Charlie, you know, at the IMA. Um, do you know who I mean? From Rob's team, like Rob's original team. Yeah, yeah. Charlie was great, and this was just a great bunch of guys. You know, yeah, they were. I mean, that was a super special time at the IMA, right? Like, I hope that Rob, you know, kind of talked enough about that, or you know, somebody else did, because I do feel like, and you know, funnily enough, I'm still referring to. I'm doing some consulting work for a friend who works in the NHS, and you know, he's setting up this like digital product lab, and I'm like, so yeah, there was this really interesting example, you know, of the IMA lab, you know, of this, you know, in the museum sector of this lab where, you know, they were kind of spinning off open source projects, right? That, you know, could be used like more widely with the, you know, within the industry, but then they were consulting, right, alongside their kind of product work. Like for me, that was such a fantastic example of really how it should be. I mean, the fact that I mean, I think I'm almost certain that Rob said that they were self-sustaining, right? I mean, you could go back and I'm sure, you know, he will have written it in the museums and the web, his museums and the web presentations and stuff. But you know, I think they were self-sustaining, weren't they? Through their they brought in so much consulting revenue that they were then able to, you know, pay for the cost of their team through this consulting revenue, which is, I mean, that's huge, right? Like for museum technology, you know, for museums to be so, any department in the museum to be self-sustaining, I think was already impressive, you know, perhaps except for this restaurant or the cafe or the shop. Like, you know, I mean, I do really genuinely you know, my aspiration for museums has always been that, you know, that they would be savvier, you know, with regard to revenue generation. And, you know, I'm not sure whether we'll get there ever, but yeah, as I say, for me, that was just an amazing model, you know, of what was possible. And you know, I'm sorry that it didn't last longer, as I'm sure Rob is as well. But you know, yeah, I don't know enough about, you know, how they felt about it, you know, kind of, I think it was probably precipitated by Max leaving or something, I don't know. But yeah, anyway, so it was okay doing, you know, the Steve instance was quite fun. And yeah, and I, you know, I sent out links and collected, you know, I used it to, as you know, in the context of the research project, you know, to collect tags as a basically a sort of a data collection tool. And yeah, so yeah, it was good. But all of this stuff, you know, was all really happened through, you know, through studying in Lugano and sticking around, you know, to continue to assist Peter, and you know, to kind of yeah, continue to sort of connect and learn from that you know, amazing group of people. So yeah, conscious of time, so we've got one more topic, haven't we? So let's talk about, just to end on a bit of a downer, the British Museum's first digital strategy. Yeah, it was I don't know, I want to say, like, to tie it back to my original point, which is that invisibility can be a beautiful thing. This is an example of what happened when, you know, the um, some of my colleagues and one of my former the most recent place that I worked, it used to say, when the eye of Sauron is turned on you, which means like all the stakeholders are looking, you know what I mean? Like suddenly the business recognizes that, you know, you're doing something interesting, and it's like, focus. And it feels a bit like the eye of Sauron. It's like suddenly people are interested, and therefore everybody has an opinion about it. And yeah, Catherine, you're nodding, so you obviously know what I'm talking about. So it suddenly feels like this wonderful autonomy that you've had, you know, where actually you've been able to be self-directed, have an idea and be like, yes, we're going to do that. Yes, we're going to try that. Why not? You know what I mean? Like, that sounds like a good thing to try. Suddenly then, you know, when you have to begin to justify everything, it's a real, yeah. I mean, it's great, right? Because you want the attention, you know, you want that, right? You want visibility for your work. You want, you know, you want resources for your work. You want it to become part of the fabric of the institution, right? In order to genuinely transform the institution, you know, then they have to pull you. You need to be close, right? You need to be close to the sort of the centers of power of the institution, right, where decisions are made, where influencers are, and so on. But equally, you then surrender, right, your, you know, a great degree of your sort of autonomy and freedom, because of the fact that it now, you know, you're working within a set of constraints, and equally, you know, needing to find a way to, you know, to kind of, yeah, it just becomes so much more political. So, so yeah, the British Museum's first digital strategy. So, I guess where this connects with my kind of personal history is that I worked for the Samsung Digital Discovery Center for 5 years. And at 5 years, that 5-year sort of point was also when the Samsung sponsorship was renewed. And although I absolutely loved my job as the you know, education manager of the SDDC, literally the best job I've ever had, would do it again in a second if I could afford to, then yeah, I mean, it was really my dream job. I absolutely loved it. But I needed to move forward in my career, and an opportunity came up for me to move into a new role, a different role, which was as like a senior content producer. In the kind of web digital team. And it's interesting because I think, you know, I mean, I say the British Museum's first digital strategy, but there's a slight, the point at which this intersects with my story, I would argue maybe was the first successful digital strategy, because there was an attempt just before that, which kind of failed, which I wasn't so close to. But if you reach out to Matthew Cock, have you spoken to Matthew? You should definitely speak to him about that, because he was very close to that first, there was a kind of first iteration of kind of what happened. And anyway, Matthew's got loads of good stuff to talk about, you know, in terms of early days of the BM, like the, you know, 100 objects, you know, history of the world in 100 objects, and oh God, he'll have amazing stuff to talk about. But anyway, so Matthew was sort of involved in that first incarnation where somebody named Tim Plyming came in, was appointed as sort of head of, you know, the British Museum. So first proper head of digital kind of thing, you know, sort of above Matthew, who was head of web at the time. And anyway, that ended up sort of ending in disaster somehow. I mean, I really don't know all the ins and outs of it. All I know is that Tim departed very abruptly, as did some of his then team. Followed him to the BBC, which is then what opened up the role for me to step into. And then someone new came into the role. So Chris Michaels, who's now the kind of head of digital and technology communications at the National Gallery, took on the role then of you know, the first head of digital, and sort of, you know, formed the first, he wrote then, you know, kind of the first, as I say, successful digital strategy. And he kind of, you know, he'd been a CEO previously, so he had lots of experience. Yeah, he handled and the political challenges of that role very adeptly, and was therefore able to get sign off on the first digital strategy. And What that meant for us was huge, massive reorganization of the team. We moved to, one of the new offices in the newest building on site, which was a treat. And we built a digital product team, and we did it for 3 years. We did a lot of really interesting things and introduced some of the practices that I'd learned about, kind of that I'd learned from at the University of Lugano, but these how design thinking practices, kind of good practices around kind of UX research, the kind of concept of the product development life cycle, and moving away from this idea of the traditional project, right? Like that's really, museums are still caught in that, and lots of, heck, I'm still caught in it. Here I am at in theory as a product startup company, as a chief product officer, and I'm still struggling. I'm still fighting that fight, against the project. And there's a place for projects as well, but museums are mired in projects, and in fact mired in delivering particularly grant funded projects, which were described 10 years before, where now literally everything has changed, and there's almost no point in doing that anymore, but yet you've committed to it, and you've received money to do it, so you have to do it, even though it's excruciating, because every step of the way you're just like, yeah, no, this doesn't make sense. Anyway, so I know you guys you've got a hard stop, haven't you? Seb, yeah, Seb was great. And actually, yeah, I in fact, I interviewed for a job with Seb when as a product manager, when he first moved to Acme, and would have loved to have taken it. I got pregnant right around that time and decided, wasn't the right time to move, but would have loved to do that, because he and I thought very similarly, about just the way of thinking about products. So I guess there's probably a little bit more to say about the digital product team at the BM. The very, very, very short version in 1 minute is that we grew the team to probably about 20, something like that, which was massive. Made a lot of ambitious, aspirational, inaccurate promises about how much revenue we were going to generate, which is all incredibly well-intentioned, but not necessarily well-grounded in a good understanding of what was realistic within the constraints and context of, the museum. And so I think that's probably, what led to the sort of decision by senior management to disband the department. And Chris departed, went to the National Gallery. The rest of us just went our own ways. I volunteered for redundancy. I could see where that was, where it was headed. Patricia Wheatley and Daniel Pett were two people who also, they're senior managers in the department. Dan will have a lot of good stories, by the way. Dan Pett, who's now at the Fitzwilliam, Ashmolean, I don't know, one of those, but he'll have some good stories about the portable antiquities scheme. You should talk to him. That was super unique and really very, super interesting to talk to him about, because in terms of crowd sourcing, information, and it was, again, total one-man band. Talk about invisibility. Whew, hugely significant for the, externally, but just not at all recognized or valued internally. And again, let's, maybe we'll leave it there, because in terms of invisibility, like that was the frustration I think that a lot of us felt in working in digital in museums, is that we established profiles within, externally, amongst, our sort of our peers at other institutions. But when we came back to our home institution, nobody cared. Like nobody really valued that work, and they also didn't value those of, or really recognize the excellence of the work that was taking place in digital, and how they had no sense of how that work, was really kind of, breaking ground and being, was hugely significant, within our field, if you see what I mean.